A ruthless mafia boss and a maid's toddler rescued a dying puppy. Years later, no one expected this. The city of Chicago never sleeps. Its streets breathe with a cold, restless pulse, the kind that seeps through your coat and settles in your bones. Neon signs bleed color onto wet pavement. Sirens cry in the distance like someone's prayer that never gets answered. And somewhere in the darkest corner of that city, in the shadow of every backroom deal and every hushed threat, lived a man the entire city feared without question. His name was Ethan Cole. 32 years old. 6'2". Eyes the color of a winter storm, gray, distant, and utterly unreadable. He had a jaw that looked carved from stone and hands that had signed documents ending careers, friendships, and sometimes lives. He wore tailored black suits and Italian leather shoes, and he always smelled faintly of expensive cologne and cigarette smoke. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. When Ethan Cole spoke in that low, measured tone, entire rooms fell silent. When he walked into a restaurant, conversation stopped mid-sentence. When his black armored SUV rolled slowly down a street, pedestrians unconsciously stepped back from the curb. He was the head of the Cole crime family, the most powerful organized crime syndicate in the Midwest. His empire stretched from the docks of Chicago's South Side all the way to the private offices of City Hall. Politicians owed him favors. Police captains looked the other way. Judges remembered who paid for their campaigns. At 32, Ethan Cole had built something most men only dream of in their darkest, most corrupt fantasies: absolute, unquestioned control. But it hadn't always been like this. There was a boy once, a skinny, brown-haired boy from a crumbling apartment on the West Side, who used to leave the last bite of his sandwich for the stray dog that waited outside his school every morning. A boy who cried when his mother sang to him at night, not from sadness, but because her voice made the world feel safe. A boy who once spent 3 hours in the rain helping an elderly neighbor carry her groceries up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken, refusing every dollar she tried to press into his small hands. That boy was gone. He had been replaced, slowly, brutally, and completely, by the man Ethan Cole had become. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It happened in pieces. It happened the night his father was shot dead in front of him when Ethan was 9 years old. It happened when his mother worked herself to sickness cleaning other people's homes, her hands cracked and bleeding every winter, still never able to make rent. It happened when the system failed them, again and again and again, until the only system that ever offered Ethan any power was the one operating outside the law. He had climbed that world ruthlessly. He had done things he never spoke of, not even to himself in the quiet dark of his bedroom at 3 in the morning. He had made himself into a weapon, sharp, precise, and without mercy, because mercy, he had learned very young, was something only the powerful could afford. And by the time he was powerful enough to afford it, he had forgotten how. His penthouse sat on the 40th floor of a glass tower downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A private elevator. A kitchen he rarely used. For bedrooms he never slept in except one. There were no photographs on the walls. No plants on the windowsills. No birthday cards on the refrigerator. Nothing soft. Nothing warm. Nothing that suggested a human being actually lived there rather than simply existed. His staff, a rotating team of bodyguards, a personal assistant named Marcus, a driver named Roy, had all learned the same unspoken rule: do not ask personal questions. Do not comment on his moods. Do not attempt friendship. Ethan Cole did not want friends. He had associates. He had employees. He had enemies. The categories were clean, manageable, and emotionally uncomplicated. Women had tried. Occasionally, someone beautiful and ambitious would enter his orbit, drawn by his power and his dark, wounded magnetism. They always left eventually. Some left quietly, with a check that ensured their silence. Others left confused, unable to understand why a man so clearly in pain refused every outstretched hand. One woman, a journalist named Claire, who had somehow made him laugh twice in one evening, had looked at him across a candlelit dinner table and said softly, "Ethan, there's still someone in there. I can see him." He had asked Roy to drive her home that night and never called her again. Because she was right. And that was the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to him. On a Tuesday evening in November, the sky the color of a bruise, the temperature dropping fast, the first real cold of the season settling over Chicago like a held breath, Ethan Cole sat in the back of his armored black SUV, a glass of bourbon in his hand, reviewing contracts on a tablet. His bodyguard, a broad-shouldered man named Dom, sat up front beside Roy, who navigated the evening traffic with practiced ease. They were stopped at a red light on West Madison Street. The rain had started 20 minutes ago, not a gentle rain, but the kind of November rain that punishes you for being outside, that drives needles of cold through your clothing and makes the world look like a photograph left out too long in the weather. The street was mostly empty. Sensible people were inside. Ethan wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was staring through the rain-streaked window the way a man stares at a wall, seeing nothing, thinking of everything, when something at the edge of his vision made him pause. A woman. Young. Maybe 26. Wearing a thin gray coat that was clearly not made for this weather, her dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. She was walking quickly, head down, one hand clutching a worn canvas bag and the other holding the hand of a very small child, a little girl, no older than 3, wearing a bright red raincoat with white buttons that somehow looked like the most colorful thing on the entire street. The woman was walking fast, clearly trying to get wherever she was going before the cold swallowed them both. But the little girl had stopped. She had simply stopped walking. And she was pointing. Her name was Juha. 3 years old, with dark eyes that absorbed the world with the kind of focused wonder that only very small children and very wise old people ever manage. She had her mother's round face and her father's stubbornness, though her father had been gone for over a year now, gone in the way that men sometimes go when the weight of responsibility becomes heavier than they can carry, leaving nothing behind but a handful of unpaid bills and a daughter who still sometimes looked at the door and waited. Juha did not fully understand why her father wasn't there anymore. But she understood most other things with startling clarity. She understood when her mother was tired, the particular quiet that fell over her at the end of a 12-hour cleaning shift, the way she moved through their small apartment like someone walking underwater. She understood when money was short, the meals that stretched, the heat turned down a little too low, the way her mother's eyes went somewhere distant when she looked at the grocery store receipts. She understood kindness. She understood fear. She understood the difference between something that was hurting and something that was okay. And right now, something was not okay. Tucked against the base of a chain-link fence, half hidden beneath a waterlogged cardboard box that had partially collapsed under the rain, something was moving. Something tiny. Something trembling so violently that even in the dim, watery light of a November evening, Juha could see the shaking from 10 feet away. Mommy. She stopped walking and pulled at her mother's hand. Her mother, whose name was Una Park, 26 years old, originally from a small town in Ohio, currently working 60 hours a week cleaning offices and hotel rooms to keep herself and her daughter in their 2-room apartment on the south side, did not stop immediately. She was cold, exhausted, and they were still 6 blocks from home. Juha, baby, come on. It's raining. Mommy. The word again, but different this time. Not a complaint. Not a request. Something more serious. Something that made Una finally stop and look at her daughter's face. Juha was not looking at her mother. She was looking at the box. Yuna followed her daughter's gaze. She saw it then, the slight movement, the desperate, rhythmic trembling of something alive and in serious trouble. She looked around. Other pedestrians, the few who were out in this weather, walked past with their heads down and their collars up. Nobody stopped. A bus rumbled by and sprayed a sheet of cold water across the sidewalk. A man in a business suit stepped around the box without so much as glancing down. Yuna hesitated. Her heart pulled in two directions at once, the direction of compassion, which had always been her truest north, and the direction of pragmatism, which her life had made unavoidable. She barely had enough in her account to cover this month's rent. The last time Juha had gotten a cold, the doctor's visit had wiped out her entire emergency fund. She could not afford a vet bill. She could not afford another mouth to feed. She could not afford to invest emotionally in something that might already be beyond saving. She took one step toward home. And Juha let go of her hand. In the way that only 3-year-olds can do, with complete, uncalculated, and utterly fearless conviction, Juha walked to the box. She crouched down in her red raincoat, her small knees pressing against the wet sidewalk, and she reached her tiny hands into the darkness beneath the collapsed cardboard. Juha, Yuna started forward instinctively. But then her daughter looked up, and the expression on that 3-year-old face stopped Yuna where she stood. Not fear. Not disgust. Something ancient and tender that had no business being on the face of someone who had only been alive for 38 months. "Mommy," Juha whispered. Her voice was so quiet that Yuna had to lean in to hear it over the rain. "He's scared." Inside the box, barely visible in the wet dark, was a puppy. Impossibly small, maybe 6 weeks old, maybe less. White with patches of brown, his fur completely soaked and matted to a body so thin that every tiny rib showed through like the keys of a broken piano. His eyes were half open and glassy. His breathing came in shallow, rapid little gasps, each one looking like it might be the last. He wasn't crying. He was past crying. He was simply enduring, in the exhausted, wordless way that small creatures endure when they have used up all their options and have nothing left but the stubborn biological fact of still being alive. Juha stroked his wet fur with 2 fingers. Gently. So gently. The puppy's trembling slowed, just barely, at her touch. Yuna stood in the rain, watching her daughter comfort a dying animal, and felt something break open inside her chest, not in a painful way, but in the way that something long compressed finally releases. She had spent the last 14 months being strong. Holding it together. Making the math work. Not crying in front of Juha. Not letting the fear show. Being, every single day, more than she felt capable of being. And here was her 3-year-old daughter, kneeling in the cold rain without a second thought, offering the only thing she had, her presence, her warmth, her small and certain hands, to a creature that the rest of the world had walked past without stopping. "He's scared, Mommy," Juha said again. And then, because she was 3 and she believed completely in her mother's ability to fix things, "Can we help him?" Yuna knelt down beside her daughter. She looked at the puppy. She looked at her daughter's face. She looked at the puppy again. She thought about the rent. About the vet bills. About the math that never added up no matter how many times she ran it. "I don't know, baby," she said honestly. "I don't know if I can." She never finished the sentence. Because a car door opened. Nobody moved when Ethan Cole moved. They got out of the way. His bodyguard Dom had turned around from the front seat the moment he saw his boss reach for the door handle, because in 3 years of working for Ethan Cole, he had never once seen the man open a car door himself from the inside without Roy having first opened it from the outside. The motion was so unexpected that Dom's hand went automatically to his jacket, to the holster beneath, before his brain caught up with his eyes. "Sir?" Dom said. Ethan didn't answer. He was already stepping out. The rain hit him immediately, not that he seemed to notice. He stood on the curb in his $3,000 suit and his Italian shoes, water soaking into his shoulders and running down the back of his collar, and he looked across the street at a woman and a child kneeling beside a collapsed cardboard box in the gutter. He didn't know why he'd gotten out. He couldn't have explained it, not even to himself. He had been watching through the window for maybe 40 seconds, long enough to see the little girl pull away from her mother, long enough to see those tiny hands reach into the darkness, long enough to hear, not hear, exactly, because the window was closed and the rain was loud, but somehow feel the words that small child had spoken. "He's scared." Something happened in the locked room behind his sternum. Something moved that hadn't moved in years. Like a door somewhere deep inside him shifted on its hinges, not open, not yet, just unlocked. He walked across the street. Dom scrambled out after him, one hand still near his jacket, eyes sweeping the empty street for threats by pure professional reflex. Roy stayed at the wheel, engine running, watching his boss through the windshield with an expression that said he had just seen something he did not have a category for. Yuna heard the footsteps and looked up. What she saw made her instinctively pull Juha slightly closer, a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive black suit, walking through the rain toward them with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in his life had reason to rush. Behind him, a second man, larger, watching the street. Behind them, a black SUV idling at the curb with tinted windows and government-grade plates. Her mind ran through possibilities quickly: drug dealer, politician, undercover cop, some kind of businessman. None of the options felt safe. She kept her body between this man and her daughter, every maternal instinct firing at once. But then the man stopped a few feet away, and he looked down. Not at Yuna. At the box. At the puppy. And something happened to his face. It was subtle, so subtle that if Yuna had blinked she would have missed it. A fractional softening around the eyes. A slight parting of the lips. The expression of someone who has seen something they were not prepared to feel anything about, and are feeling something anyway. He crouched down. Ethan Cole, feared by criminals and politicians alike, crouched down on a wet Chicago sidewalk in the rain and looked at a dying puppy the size of his fist. He looked at the animal for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at the little girl in the red raincoat, who was looking back at him with absolutely no fear whatsoever, just the calm, open curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of powerful men. "He's sick," Juha told him, with the matter-of-fact gravity of a small person delivering an important briefing. "He's scared and he's cold and he needs help." Something shifted behind Ethan's storm-gray eyes. "Yeah," he said. His voice, usually smooth and controlled and utterly without vulnerability, came out rough at the edges. "Yeah, he does." He looked up at Yuna. She was watching him with a complicated expression, wary, confused, exhausted, and something she was clearly trying to hide, which was the desperate hope that this stranger who had stepped out of an expensive car was about to say something that would make this situation solvable. "There's a 24-hour emergency vet 4 blocks from here," Ethan said. "I'll take him." Yuna stared at him. "I'm sorry." "The dog." He gestured toward the puppy with one hand. "If we leave him here, he won't make it through the night. The vet's 4 blocks away. I'll take care of the bill." Yuna opened her mouth. Closed it. Looked at this man, at his expensive suit, at his cold, complicated eyes, at the bodyguard hovering 10 feet behind him, and tried to make any of this make sense. "Why?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Not because it was a difficult question, but because it was an honest one, and honest questions were not something Ethan Cole had much experience with in his daily life. People asked him for things. They threatened him. They bargained with him. They were afraid of him. They did not simply ask him why. He looked at Juha again. The little girl had turned back to the puppy and was still stroking him with those two careful fingers, whispering something too quiet to hear, her small shoulders hunched against the rein but not moving, not leaving, completely committed to this act of comfort even though she was soaking wet and cold and this animal was essentially a stranger. "Because your daughter didn't walk away," Ethan said quietly. "And that means something." Yuna looked at her daughter. She looked at this man. She looked at the puppy, whose breathing was becoming more labored by the second. She made the only decision a mother with a heart like hers could make. "Okay," she said. Ethan took off his jacket, his $3,000 jacket, and wrapped the puppy in it without hesitation. He cradled the small bundle against his chest. And then Ethan Cole, the most feared man in Chicago, walked through the November rain toward his car with a dying puppy held gently against his heart, while a 3-year-old girl in a red raincoat trotted beside him, one small hand gripping his finger because she had simply reached up and taken it, and he had not pulled away. Dom watched this from 10 feet back. He would later tell Roy, in the parking lot of the emergency vet, speaking in the low voice of a man who has witnessed something he cannot explain, "I've seen him walk away from a man begging for his life. Tonight he stopped for a dog. I don't know what that means, but I think something just changed." The emergency veterinary clinic was called All Hours Animal Care, and it was exactly the kind of place that exists because suffering doesn't keep business hours: fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, a waiting room with plastic chairs and a bulletin board covered in lost pet flyers, some of them months old. The woman at the front desk looked up when the door opened, prepared for the usual: a anxious pet owner, a carrier, a leash. What she got instead was a man in a soaking wet dress shirt carrying something wrapped in what appeared to be a very expensive suit jacket, followed by a woman in a thin coat and a small child who was still wearing her red raincoat and dripping steadily onto the linoleum. "Puppy," Ethan said. "He's in bad shape. I need someone right now." 3 things about the way he said it communicated that this was not a request: his tone, his eyes, and the way Dom quietly positioned himself near the door like a man who was prepared to make the evening complicated for anyone who disagreed. They were seen immediately. The vet on duty was a woman named Dr. Angela Reeves, 38, tired in the way that night shift doctors are tired, competent in the way that people who have chosen difficult work for good reasons are competent. She took the puppy from the wrapped jacket with practiced hands and carried him directly to the examination table. Ethan stood in the doorway of the exam room. Yuna stood behind him. Juha stood between them, her small hand now holding her mother's, her eyes fixed on the puppy with an intensity that would have been remarkable in an adult and was extraordinary in a 3-year-old. "How old?" Dr. Reeves asked, not looking up. "I don't know. We found him on the street. 6, maybe 7 weeks. She checked his gums, his eyes, his breathing. Hypothermic. Severely malnourished. Probably been outside for at least 2 days." She paused. "He's critical." The word landed in the room like a stone in water. Juha's grip on her mother's hand tightened. Yuna looked at her daughter's face and saw something there that broke her heart, not panic, but a particular kind of quiet grief that children display when they understand that something precious might be taken from them before they've had a chance to properly love it. "Can you save him?" Juha asked. Dr. Reeves looked at this small child, soaking wet, rain-flushed, completely serious, and her professional composure softened at the edges. "I'm going to try my very hardest," she said. And she meant it. The next 2 hours were the strangest 2 hours of Ethan Cole's life. He sat in a plastic chair in an animal hospital waiting room at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, his wet shirt drying stiffly on his body, his suit jacket currently wrapped around a dying puppy in an exam room down the hall. Dom sat beside him, having long since stopped trying to understand the evening. Roy had texted 3 times asking whether to keep the engine running. Ethan had not responded. Yuna sat across from him, Juha asleep across her lap, the little girl's red raincoat still damp, her small chest rising and falling with the deep, complete peace of a child who had done everything within her power and trusted that it would be enough. Ethan watched the sleeping child. He had been watching her, without fully realizing it, for the last 20 minutes. There was something about the absolute stillness of her, the way she slept without worry, her tiny hand curled under her chin, her face smooth and open and unguarded, that reached into a place inside him he had stopped visiting a very long time ago. "She always like that?" he asked quietly, nodding at Juha. Yuna looked at her daughter. A small, complicated smile crossed her tired face. "Like what?" "Like the world is exactly the size it needs to be. Like she's not afraid of any of it." Yuna was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful but honest. "She's 3. She doesn't know yet that it can hurt you. You're going to have to tell her eventually." "I know." Yuna smoothed a strand of wet hair from her daughter's sleeping face. "But I'm trying to hold off as long as I can." Ethan said nothing. He looked at the floor. Then at his hands, large, scarred hands that had done things this woman across from him would never know about and would never want to. Then at the sleeping child again. "She lost her dad," Yuna said, not harshly, just as a fact. "Last year. He left." She paused. "Juha still checks the door sometimes." The words hit Ethan somewhere unprotected. He didn't show it. He had perfected the art of receiving blows without flinching. But inside, in that recently unlocked room behind his sternum, something ached with a recognition he couldn't name. He thought about a small boy on the west side, checking the door. Waiting. Learning eventually that waiting was a form of hoping, and hoping was a form of vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing the world consistently and mercilessly punished. He had stopped checking the door a very long time ago. Dr. Reeves appeared in the hallway at 11:45. Both adults looked up immediately. She was smiling, not broadly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just won a small, important battle. "He's stable," she said. "It's going to take time. He'll need warmth, proper nutrition, monitoring. But he's going to make it." Yuna pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled. Juha, who had apparently not been fully asleep, sat up and looked at the doctor with those ancient dark eyes. "He's okay?" "He's okay, sweetheart." Juha nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving confirmed intelligence. "I knew it," she said. "Because we didn't leave him." In the plastic chair across the room, Ethan Cole stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and told Dom to settle the bill, the entire bill, including the overnight monitoring, the 4 fluids, and the follow-up care. He did it without being asked. Without looking for gratitude. He simply did it, the way you do things when something in you has remembered, without warning, that doing them matters. Winter came to Chicago the way it always does, without apology. The weeks after the rain-soaked night in November folded into each other quietly. Ethan Cole went back to his life, the meetings, the deals, the carefully constructed empire that required his constant and total attention. On the surface, nothing changed. He was still Ethan Cole. Men still went quiet when he entered rooms. Roy still drove him through the city in the black SUV. Dom still stood near exits and watched for threats. But something had shifted beneath the surface. A hairline fracture in a wall that had been solid for 20 years. He found out their names without trying very hard, a name, an address, a file that took Marcus 20 minutes to compile. Una Park, 26. Housekeeper and commercial cleaning contractor. Single mother. Monthly income, not enough. Monthly expenses, too much. One daughter, Juha, age 3. Apartment on the south side. The puppy, now named Dory by Juha, after a combination of doorstep and the word the little girl used for gift in a half-remembered Korean word her grandmother had once used, was recovering at the clinic, visited daily by a small girl in a red raincoat who reportedly told the vet tech every single morning, "He knows I'm here." Ethan read the file. He set it down. He picked it up again. He told himself he was simply tying up a loose end, the way he always did after an unexpected complication. He needed to make sure there were no consequences from the evening that could circle back to him. That was all. He started small. An anonymous delivery to Una's building management, 6 months of rent, paid ahead, from a building maintenance fund that didn't exist before that week and would never be referenced again. A grocery store gift card, tucked under her apartment door in an unmarked envelope, refilled automatically at the start of each month through a shell account Marcus had set up. New winter clothing for Juha, a proper heavy coat, waterproof boots, warm leggings, left in a bag outside the apartment door with a note that read only, "For the girl who doesn't walk away." No signature. Una was bewildered. She asked the building manager about the rent. He shrugged, showed her the payment record, said it must have been a building assistance program. She asked her neighbor. She asked the grocery store. She found nothing that pointed anywhere. She sat in her apartment at night, looking at the evidence of an invisible kindness, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, like someone was watching over them. Not in a frightening way. In the way that the universe occasionally, inexplicably, decides to tilt in your favor. Dory came home in December, 6 weeks after that rainy night, officially healthy and unofficially the most loved animal in the continental United States, at least by one 3-year-old. Juha received him at the door of their apartment with a solemnity that bordered on ceremonial, kneeling down on the hallway floor and pressing her small forehead gently to his. "I told you," she whispered to him. "I told you we wouldn't leave." The puppy licked her face from chin to forehead, and the sound of her laughter echoed down the hallway of that small south side building like something that had been missing and finally came back. Ethan heard about it through Marcus, who had, at Ethan's quiet request, made sure someone kept a general eye on the building. Not intrusive. Not surveillance, exactly. Just the kind of quiet attention that meant someone was there if something went wrong. He heard about the dog coming home. He heard about Juha's laughter. He sat in his penthouse that night, 40 floors above the city, and he thought about that laughter. He tried to remember the last time he had heard a sound that completely uncomplicated. A sound with nothing underneath it, no agenda, no performance, no calculated effect. Just joy, pure and structureless as water. He couldn't remember. In the spring, Marcus enrolled Juha in a private pre-K program, one of the best in the South Side, the kind with a real art room and a garden and teachers who had advanced degrees and cared deeply about what they were doing. The tuition was paid through an education trust that named no donor. Una received a letter informing her that Juha had been selected for a full scholarship based on a community merit program. She cried for 20 minutes over the letter, then called her mother in Ohio. "Mama," she said. "Something's happening. Something good. I don't understand it, but something good is happening." Ethan never visited. He never called. He never asked for acknowledgement or gratitude or even awareness. He operated in pure shadow, the way he had always operated, except that now the shadow was cast in the direction of something other than power. It was not a transformation. He was clear-eyed about that. He was still Ethan Cole. He still ran his empire. He still made choices that decent people would have been horrified by. The world he lived in did not allow for complete reinvention. You don't rebuild yourself from scratch at 32 when the foundation you're standing on is made of things that can't be walked back. But something had been returned to him. Some small, essential thing, a pilot light that he had assumed was extinguished years ago, had apparently been burning all along, deep enough that nothing had reached it. And now it had been found. A 3-year-old girl in a rain-soaked red raincoat had found it, by simply refusing to walk away from something that was hurting. By whispering 2 words, "He's scared," with a purity that cut through 20 years of armor like it was nothing at all. He thought about that sometimes, late at night in his silent penthouse, the city spread out below him like a map of everything he controlled and nothing he loved. He thought about how small the moment had been. A red light. A cardboard box. A child's hands. 2 words. He thought about how the largest changes in a person's life are almost never announced. They arrive small and quiet, dressed in ordinary clothes, in the middle of unremarkable Tuesday evenings. They arrive before you have time to protect yourself from them. And if you're paying attention, if, for just one unguarded moment, you happen to look out the window, they reach you. 7 years passed. Chicago changed. The city always changes, new buildings replace old wounds, new alliances replace old enemies, new power structures rise from the rubble of the ones before them. Ethan Cole's empire weathered what empires must weather: betrayals, investigations, territorial challenges from younger and more reckless men who hadn't yet learned that recklessness was just another word for a shorter life expectancy. He was 39 now. Not older in any visible way that his enemies could use, still precise, still controlled, still the most dangerous man in any room he entered. But older in ways he felt at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come, when the weight of 2 decades of choices pressed down on his chest like something physical. Juha was 10. She was extraordinary, not in the way that parents say about their children as a matter of loyalty, but in the observable, documented way that her teachers noted on every report card and her mother quoted verbatim to anyone who would listen. She was sharp and curious and deeply, constitutionally kind in a way that seemed to come from her bones rather than her upbringing. She won her school's essay competition 3 years running. She volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. She had read 47 books in the previous school year, a fact she mentioned with the quiet pride of someone who considers reading to be both a pleasure and a responsibility. And she was inseparable from Dory. The puppy had grown into a medium-sized dog of indeterminate and beautiful breed, white with brown patches, with intelligent amber eyes and the particular loyalty of an animal that has been loved by a child from the moment it first understood what love was. He slept at the foot of Juha's bed. He walked her to the corner where the school bus came every morning and was sitting at that corner every afternoon when the bus came back. He seemed to understand her moods with a sensitivity that bordered on uncanny, pressing his solid warm weight against her when she was sad, bouncing ridiculous circles around her when she was happy, watching her with those amber eyes with a steadiness that suggested he took his responsibility seriously. He had never forgotten, in some wordless animal way, the night in the cold rain when small hands had found him in the dark and warmth had followed. He carried that memory in his body, in the particular gentleness of how he pressed against Juha's legs, in the way he always came back to her. Una had built something real. The cleaning business had grown, she now employed 4 other women and had contracts with 3 office buildings. She had moved them to a better apartment, 2 bedrooms, a small balcony where she grew tomatoes in the summer. She had never discovered who had been helping them all those years, the rent, the groceries, the scholarship, but she had her suspicions. The shoes were expensive. The timing was too precise. The kindness was too consistent. She thought sometimes about the man in the rain. About his storm gray eyes and the way they had looked at her daughter. She thought about the question she had asked him, why, and the answer he had given. Because your daughter didn't walk away. And that means something. She thought, whoever you are, thank you. Whatever you've done, wherever you are. Thank you. On a Friday night in October, Ethan Cole was returning from a meeting that had gone sideways in ways he was still mentally cataloging. A competing family, newer, less disciplined, with the particular boldness of people who hadn't yet lost enough, had been testing his borders for months. The meeting had been an attempt at negotiation. It had ended badly. Not violently, not yet, but with the particular tension that precedes violence like a pressure system precedes a storm. He was in the back of the SUV, alone. Roy driving, Dom running point in the front, 2 additional vehicles flanking them through the night streets. They were 3 blocks from the warehouse district when the first vehicle hit them. It came from a side street, fast, deliberate, a black truck with its plates removed that caught the front of the SUV on the passenger side and drove them sideways into a concrete barrier. The impact was enormous. Dom's head hit the windshield. Roy fought the wheel and lost. The world rotated. What followed happened in the compressed, nonlinear way that violence always happens, not like film, not with clear sequence, but in fragments and sounds and pain. Gunfire. Shouting. The sound of the second flanking vehicle's tires screaming. Return fire from his security team. More shouting. And then a second impact, something thrown, something that detonated against the SUV's reinforced door and drove shrapnel through the compromised window. Ethan was hit. He didn't know immediately how badly. The body in crisis has a grace period, the adrenaline, the shock, the pure animal commitment to surviving the next 60 seconds that overrides all other systems. He knew he was bleeding. He knew he was outside the vehicle somehow, had been thrown or had thrown himself, and he was now on the ground behind the concrete barrier while the firefight continued on the other side of it. He knew, with a calm that surprised him, that he was losing blood faster than was sustainable. His phone was gone. Dom was down. Roy, he didn't know about Roy. His remaining security team was engaged. The alley behind the barrier stretched 50 feet to a chain-link fence and beyond that, a service road and darkness. He pressed his hand against his side. Felt the warmth, the slickness. The particular cold that begins at the edges of severe blood loss. He thought, with strange clarity, this is how it ends. On pavement. In the dark. Alone. He had always known, in the abstract way that people who live dangerous lives know it, that this was one of the ways things could end. He had made his peace with most of his life. He had not made peace with one thing, one small, silent thread of connection to something human that he had never acknowledged and never destroyed and never had the courage to walk toward. A girl in a red raincoat. A dying puppy. He's scared. He thought, should have said thank you. I should have said it out loud, to someone, at least once. He was still thinking this when he heard the sound. A dog. Barking, sharp, urgent, directional. Not the random bark of a street animal spooked by the noise. Something purposeful. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. Ethan turned his head. Amber eyes in the dark. Dory had not been supposed to be there. On Friday evenings, Juha's Saturday animal shelter volunteer shift meant Dory came along, Una drove them both, dropped Juha off, and on the return trip, Dory liked to press his face to the window of the car and watch the city go past with the earnest attention of someone cataloging it for future reference. They lived 12 blocks from the warehouse district. They had passed that way 100 times. When the sound started, the collision, the gunfire, Una had pulled over immediately, her heart hammering, trying to see what was happening and decide in which direction to drive away from it. In the 30 seconds that she was stopped, Dory did something he had never done before in 7 years of being an impeccably behaved dog. He went through the half-open window. Una screamed his name. He was gone before she finished the word, a white and brown shape disappearing into the dark at full sprint, heading directly toward the sound of gunfire with a certainty that made no rational sense. She called Juha. Then she called 911. Her hands were shaking. On the other side of the concrete barrier, Dory found Ethan Cole in approximately 40 seconds. The dog came around the end of the barrier fast and low, and then stopped completely when he reached the man on the ground. He stood over him. He pressed his nose against Ethan's face, the face of the man he had never met as a grown dog, but whose hands had carried him out of the rain 7 years ago, wrapped in warmth, when he had been so close to gone that he would not have survived another hour. Animals don't remember faces. They remember something else, something in the cells, in the specific combination of scent and warmth and the quality of touch. Whatever Dory remembered, he remembered it now. He pressed himself against Ethan's chest, and he barked, not away, not randomly, but toward the service road and the open space beyond, in the specific direction from which help might come. Then he ran. To the fence. Back to Ethan. To the fence again. Back and forth with frantic precision, the distilled intelligence of 7 years of loving a child who had taught him by example that you do not leave something that is hurting. You stay. You call for help. You bring the world to where it's needed. The paramedics found Ethan Cole 12 minutes later, guided by a dog who refused to stop barking until they were kneeling beside the right man. 12 minutes. Later, in the hospital, the surgical team would say that another 8 or 9 minutes on that pavement would have moved the outcome from critical but survivable to simply fatal. He lost consciousness as they lifted him onto the stretcher. The last thing he was aware of was the weight of a dog pressing warm and solid against his leg, refusing, even with paramedics arriving, even with the crisis resolving, even now, to leave. He woke in the hospital on a Sunday morning. White ceiling. The smell of antiseptic. The sound of machines that measured the fact of his still being alive in small, regular beeps. His side was a landscape of bandages and managed pain. His mouth was dry. His mind surfaced slowly through layers of medication and exhaustion, assembling itself piece by piece. He turned his head. Una Park was asleep in the chair beside his bed. 26 had become 33, there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a steadiness in her face that 7 years of building something real had put there. She was still wearing what she'd had on Friday night, a gray sweater, her hands folded in her lap. On the small hospital couch against the wall, Juha was asleep with her head on Dory's flank. The dog was awake, lying perfectly still so as not to disturb the sleeping child, but with his amber eyes open, watching the room with the alert patience of someone on duty. When Ethan turned his head and their eyes met, Dory's tail moved once. Carefully. So as not to wake Juha. 10 years old now. Dark hair loose across her face. The red raincoat was long gone, replaced by a jacket the deep blue of a clear winter sky. But the face was the same round seriousness, the same openness, the same quality of being completely and uncomplicatedly present in the world that had stopped him at a red light on a rainy November evening 7 years ago. He looked at them for a long time. The woman who had asked him why. The girl who had not walked away. The dog who had come back. He felt something happening in his chest that he did not have the architecture to manage. Something large and long compressed and entirely without the dignity that he had spent his adult life maintaining. His throat tightened. His eyes burned. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since he was 9 years old, kneeling on a sidewalk not entirely unlike the one he had nearly died on Friday night, while strangers gathered around a man in a pool of dark blood and a small boy learned in the space of 30 seconds that the world did not protect the people you loved simply because you loved them. He had decided that night, not consciously, but in the way that children make foundational decisions when they are too young to know they're doing it, that the only way to survive a world like that was to stop needing it to be anything other than what it was. Stop hoping. Stop waiting at the door. Stop leaving the last bite of your sandwich for anyone. He had kept that decision for 23 years. He had been, by every external measure, enormously successful at it. And yet, here was a woman who had worked 60 hours a week and kept her heart open anyway. Here was a girl who had knelt in the cold rain without being asked. Here was a dog that had run toward gunfire because something in his animal memory recognized the man on the ground and could not in any instinct deep way be persuaded to leave him. Nobody in this room had needed him to be good. None of them had asked him to change. None of them had made speeches or demands or delivered ultimatums. They had simply, quietly, consistently, across 7 years and one rainy night, been exactly who they were. And somehow that had been enough. Somehow the simple persistence of their humanity had done what nothing else had ever managed to do. It had reached him. His breath hitched. His hand moved to his eyes. It was involuntary, helpless, the way grief is helpless, the way love is helpless when it arrives after a very long absence and finds the door finally unlocked. The sound he made woke Yuna. She looked at him, at this man she had feared and been grateful toward and thought about for 7 years and never understood, and she saw his face. For a moment she simply looked. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his, the way you do when someone is in pain that is larger than comfort but needs to know they are not alone in it. Dory stood, stretched, and walked to the side of the bed with quiet purpose. He rested his chin on the mattress beside Ethan's arm. His tail moved slowly. Juha sat up, rubbing her eyes, and then looked at the man in the hospital bed and recognized that he was crying. She slid off the couch without hesitation and walked to the bed in her socks on the hospital floor, and she placed one small hand on his arm with the same gesture she had used 7 years ago on a dying puppy in a cardboard box in the rain. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just stayed. Ethan Cole, 39 years old, the most feared man in Chicago, wept in a hospital room on a Sunday morning while a woman held his hand and a dog rested his chin on the bed and a 10-year-old girl stood beside him in her socks and refused, with the quiet certainty that had always been her most essential quality, to walk away. Later, much later, after the surgeries and the recovery and the months that followed, when Ethan Cole began the long and non-linear process of becoming someone slightly different from who he had been, he would try occasionally to explain what had happened to him. To himself, mostly, in the silence of 3 a.m. When words seemed possible. The world teaches you early, he thought, that hardness is safety. That if you don't need anything, nothing can be taken from you. That love is a liability and hope is a form of stupidity and the only honest position is to expect nothing and prepare for the worst. And for 23 years he had lived by that teaching with extraordinary faithfulness. And he had been safe. And he had been powerful. And he had been completely, absolutely, and unrelentingly alone in the most fundamental way that a human being can be alone, not for lack of people, but for want of a single moment in which he allowed himself to be actually seen. A 3-year-old girl in a red raincoat had seen him. Not because she was trying to. Not because she understood who he was or what he had done or what he represented. But because that was simply what she did, she looked at things. She looked at a dying puppy in a cardboard box and didn't turn away. She looked at a cold and complicated stranger across a sidewalk and reached up and took his finger because it seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at a weeping man in a hospital bed and walked over in her socks and put her hand on his arm and stayed. She had not fixed him. He was not fixed. He would not be for a long time, perhaps ever, a simple or innocent or easily redeemed man. The things he had done did not disappear because his heart had reopened. The world he had built did not dismantle itself because he had wept in a hospital room. Redemption, real redemption, is not a moment. It is a direction. A daily choice, made again and again, imperfectly and without guarantee, toward the person you might still become. But the direction had been found. Found in a rainy night in a cardboard box, and the words of a child who looked at a shaking, frightened, barely breathing thing and whispered, simply, truthfully, without agenda, "He's scared." Because sometimes that is all it takes. Not a grand gesture. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a speech or an intervention or a revelation. Sometimes all it takes is 2 words, spoken with complete and undefended honesty, at the exact moment when a locked door has been loosened by enough years of cold. He's scared. And the world, the cold, unforgiving, merciless world that Ethan Cole had made his peace with, cracked open. And the light came in.